Hi guys, welcome back. In this video, we will discuss everything that an A-level student should be knowing about budget deficits. So make sure that you watch the video till the end as it will be an important video. We will cover what budget deficits are, why do they occur, what are its economic implications, and the pros and cons of budget deficit. So a budget deficit, guys, occurs when the government's expenditures exceeds its tax revenues, right, in a fiscal year. And what it means is that the government spends more money than it collects in taxes. And this shortfall, right, when your government spending is more than your tax revenues, so this shortfall or this extra spending or excess spending that the government is doing is basically financed through borrowing, right? Because the tax money is insufficient to finance that spending. So the remainder is borrowed by the government either by issuing government bonds or any other form of debt instruments. Now guys, we need to see that why do budget deficits basically occur. That is, what are the reasons for budget deficits. Now budget deficits, guys, are also known as fiscal deficits, and I want you to write this down. They are called fiscal deficits. Now economic theory divides the budget deficits into three causes. That is, there are three reasons why they primarily occur. Three factors basically. So if the first is your cyclical factor, the second is structural, and then they occur due to government policy. And when you talk about cyclical factors, so cyclical factors are those factors that cause a budget deficit, but then there are those factors that will automatically cause that deficit without the government enacting a budget deficit or without the government enacting one. That is, without the government implementing a budget deficit or enacting a budget deficit as part of its expansionary fiscal policy. So, for example, we know that when the government implements an expansionary policy, fiscal policy, the government runs into a budget deficit. The government has to run a budget deficit in that case because the government spending will go up while tax revenues need to go down in a budget deficit. When the government is implementing expansionary fiscal policy, because the government needs to boost JD, so government spending has to go up. The government has to increase the government spending purposely, while on different projects like infrastructure, on maybe increasing public sector wages, on healthcare, education, while the government has to cut down its taxes to boost aggregate demand. But when you're talking about a cyclical when we're talking about cyclical factors that cause a budget deficit, so it's happening automatically due to the fluctuations in the trade cycle. So, for example, when we talk about economic fluctuations in the business or the trade cycle, we're talking about recessions and booms occurring. So, what happens is that and these are the reasons that these economic fluctuations that occur in the trade cycle, they are the reason that cause budget deficits to happen, right? They are the reasons why budget deficits ultimately end up going up or going down, either increasing or decreasing. And let me give you an example. So for example, let's say during economic downturns and recessions, if your economy is going through a recession, which is an economic downturn, the government may automatically run a budget deficit. Without maybe the government even intentionally wanting a budget deficit, the government may automatically run a budget deficit because in a recession, tax revenues received are low, right? Because obviously the businesses are earning less profits, businesses are closing down, or maybe they're earning less profits, so corporate tax revenues will fall. Incomes of individuals are low because they're working less hours, or they don't have jobs, they're not earning enough money, so income tax revenues are low as well. While people are not spending money, individuals, so consumer spending is low because of low consumer confidence, so obviously tax revenues from VAT and sales tax is also low as well, while unemployment is high at the same time, right? And because unemployment is high in a recession, government spending automatically goes up in a recession. Why? On what areas the government spending goes up automatically? The social welfare programs and income support, because more of the people who are now unemployed, previously they weren't, but now in a recession they're unemployed, they become automatically eligible for these income support programs. So automatically the government has to end up paying more. So government spending on these income support and social welfare goes up, right? While tax revenues are going down. So this leads to a budget deficit automatically in a recession, right? Because government spending goes up while tax revenues fall in a recession. So when you're talking about why do budget deficits occur, one of the reasons why they occur is which are the cyclical factors, because of cyclical fluctuation in the trade cycle, right? And you can give that example, like for example, a budget deficit automatically happening in a recession. Then, guys, we have structural factors basically that affect the budget position of the government, right? And it's called, and the structural factors leads to, or you can say the deficit or the fiscal deficit that arises because of these structural factors. That part of the fiscal deficit represents a structural deficit, right? It which represents that part of the budget deficit that is not related to the state of the economy. So you see, these cyclical factors created a cyclical deficit, right? Because it was related to the state of the economy. It occurred in a recession, right? But these structural factors would result in a deficit, which we call it, which is obviously a fiscal deficit, but that part of the deficit is known as a structural deficit. And it occurs unrelated. It occurs even if you are in a recession, it's not related to the state of the economy. So this part of the fiscal deficit, will not disappear even when the economy recovers. So even if your recession recover you recover from a recession, this part of fiscal deficit will not disappear at all. So economists say that a structural budget deficit would occur even when the economy is at full employment. Even if you are at full employment, still, it would occur. And so it follows that even when the economy is performing as well as it possibly could or can, the government will still not be earning enough tax revenue to sort of fully cover its government spending. And hence we will have a budget deficit, which would be the structural cause of that deficit, also represented by or given the name of a structural deficit. Now, guys, you see the structural fact and this structural factor, the structural factors or the structural factor could represent or does represent, in fact, a long term or could represent a long term imbalance between government spending and your tax revenue. So this difference that could arise would be long term. So it's representing a long term imbalance between your government spending and tax revenue, meaning that such a deficit could be long term if such structural issues are not addressed by the government or the state. And one example of structural factor that you could give in your answers, or you should be knowing as an A-level student, is that such a deficit is caused due to demographic changes in the economy, such as aging populations. So if the economy has an aging population, the population is aging, that would automatically lead to increased healthcare spending by the government, and it will increase the pension cost on the government as populations age and more people retire. Not only do they retire, but they age as well. And you have a higher average age in the economy, and that automatically puts strain on the government finances, right? And this is not something that could be addressed through influencing the demand in the economy. I mean, this is a structural issue. You need to address this. Otherwise, it will result in continuous long-term spending on the government. And the more aging population you have, the less tax revenues would be collected as well. So this is the long-term imbalance that we're talking about for a budget deficit. So you have higher government spending and less tax revenue coming from these retired people because they're not earning anything, right? And they're aging and they're retired, and they're relying on government pensions and support programs. And not only that, but in fact, when you have an aging population, automatically the government needs to spend more on healthcare spending. There are different forms of healthcare spending that the government does. There's more spending or budget allocated to health services, right? Again, putting a strain on government finances. So that's another reason why that falls under structural factors for a budget deficit, and another reason why budget deficit occurs. So as an A-level student, you must be knowing this. Now, guys, another reason why the government may run into a budget deficit is basically it has to do with government policy, where the government basically uses active fiscal stimulus to basically stimulate aggregate demand or lift aggregate demand to recover from recession, right? Which is basically active stabilization policy or active demand management. where the government injects fiscal stimulus, and it does this by enacting a budget deficit intentionally. So here the government is enacting, under government policy, the government is basically enacting the budget deficit intentionally as part of their fiscal policy to achieve a specific economic goal, which is obviously to recover from a recession. So under expansionary fiscal policy during economic downturns, the government may deliberately run that budget deficit to boost AD and stimulate AD and stimulate that economic activity, such as increasing government spending on infrastructure projects, healthcare, education, maybe increasing unemployment benefits. Although some unemployment benefits, although some spending on unemployment benefits automatically goes up as part of automatic stabilizers, but the government could also come up with various other sorts of unemployment benefits as well, so that the government could sort of give more money in the hands of the people so that they could boost, or they could boost their spending, or to increase consumer spending basically. All right. And also cutting up taxes so that people could have more disposable income, so that they could spend or they could invest, such as cutting corporate taxes. So that's part of expansive fiscal policy. And obviously when you're cutting taxes to stimulate AD, because you want to stimulate CNI of the AD, and you're increasing government spending deliberately because you are so much concerned about the recession that you want the economy to stabilize itself and get out of that recession. So obviously the government will run into a budget deficit. In fact, it enacts that budget deficit, right? So guys, another reason why budget deficits occur is because, at times the government is paying, heavy interest on its existing debt. So when the government is paying interest on its existing debt, or maybe that interest expense is going up, which obviously leads to a rise in it leads to a rise in your debt servicing costs, right? So that's another reason why budget deficits could occur. And another very good reason why they could occur is, although it's not part of government policy, you could say that it's more of a political consideration, or more of a political stance or a political play by the government, where the government what the government does is that the government basically prioritizes short-term political goals over executing fiscal discipline. I mean, there should be some sort of fiscal discipline by the government as well. There should be a limit to the amount of spending the government does. At times that, spending could be unnecessary, or that spending could be for reasons that is not justified, or maybe the reasons are to just sort of gain popularity, because it has some sort of a short-term political motive, maybe just to get elected in the next coming elections. And that leads to deficit spending then, right? And the government just spends a lot of money so that it could make people happy, and it reduces the taxes as well so that it could gain some sort of popularity to win the elections. So here and the economic way of writing this is that you say that the government prioritizes short-term political goals over fiscal discipline, right? And this leads to deficit spending then. The government could end up funding popular programs, or just implementing tax cuts to gain that electoral support. So even if all of this is contributing to a budget deficit or budget imbalance, budget deficit isn't budget imbalance, right? So this is another reason that you should know. So guys, then it follows that budget deficits can occur naturally due to economic conditions such as a recession, or the budget deficits could occur as a result of deliberate government actions, which is aimed at achieving a specific economic goal, or maybe some sort of a political objective, right? And guys, if you look at the economic implications, a budget deficit can result into so a budget deficit can basically result into the interest rates going up and the crowding out effect to take place. And so what happens is that when the government, let's say, enacts a budget deficit to bring the economy out of recession by increasing its deficit spending, right? What happens is that the government does more borrowing to finance the deficit. And when the government borrows money from financial institutions such as commercial banks by issuing them government bonds, that money which was available to be loaned out to businesses, so some or major part of it goes to the government as the government borrows, right? and hence there is less money left over to be loaned out. And this reduces the supply of funds that are to be loaned out, which then drives up the interest rates. And when interest rates go up, and when the supply of funds that are to be loaned out goes down and interest rate goes up, this results into the crowding out effect. This will cause crowding out, which is the idea. I mean, what is crowding out? Crowding out is the idea that the government's deficit financing, which the government did as part of the expansionary fiscal policy, that the idea that the government's deficit financing, which was designed to help the economy by bringing it out of recession, actually ends up hurting the economy because it increases interest rates in the economy, and hence that decreases investments, right? So the rise in G, that is government spending, is offset by a fall in I, that is investments, right? So that is what it is, that the government's deficit financing that was actually originally designed to help the economy, ends up hurting the economy because it increases the interest rates and hence decreases investments. Why would investments go down? Because cost of borrowing goes up because of a rise in interest rates, and hence that decreases. When investments goes down, that decreases economic growth, that reduces growth, right? And when we study the crowding out effect, I mean, for us as economists and policymakers, we realize that crowding out effect is an important concept, and it matters. Crowding out effect matters, and it is an important concept for understanding what effects can government spending have on the economy, right? Because from what we see is that the government spending is having negative effects on economic growth. And this is a very strong point that you guys can write as an evaluation for does government spending increases growth, right? Because here it is reducing growth when the crowding out effect takes place. Which means that governments need to be aware of this effect basically when deciding how much to spend on the economy. Right? And on the other hand, it's also telling us that private investment is an important factor for economic growth, right? So it is important for governments in the economy to create an environment that encourages private investment, right, guys? And now if you look at the pros and cons of budget deficit, right? So starting from the pros, I mean, there are various advantages that a government that a budget deficit could bring into for the economy. First of all, it could act as an economic stimulus because deficit spending is what results into a budget deficit, and that can the deficit spending itself that is causing the budget deficit can stimulate economic growth during recessions by increasing aggregate demand through increasing government spending in the economy that could lift the economy out of recessions and restore the negative output gap and restore economy's real GDP back to potential GDP, right? Also, I mean, when the government is spending when the government is when the government runs into a budget deficit and it finances that through borrowing so that it could fund its spending. In other words, when the government does deficit spending, so the government could end up through borrowing, the government could end up funding public investments in the economy, in infrastructure, education, research and development, which will automatically enhance long-term economic productivity, which will result into a shift in economy's productive capacity and potential. So this is such an important factor that if the government is enacting a budget deficit, so the government spending in these areas could result in long-term productive capacity of the economy to shift outward, which would be represented by a shift in your LRA S curve to the right and your PPC to the right. Also remember that budget deficits act as counter-cyclical tools, right? A budget deficit acts as a counter-cyclical tool, and when I'm saying it acts as a counter-cyclical tool, what I'm saying is that we know that as we study the economic cycle, we know that economies experiences recessions and booms. So it basically, a budget deficit could reduce the extent of the cyclical fluctuations and stabilize the cyclical fluctuations by reducing the size of these recessions, right? For example, how this would happen, for example, like we already studied that some budget deficit would automatically occur in a recession as government spending goes up, while especially on unemployment benefits and income support, as people become eligible automatically for those programs, income support programs, while tax revenues automatically go down in a budget deficit, in a recession, as businesses and individuals are out of income and profit, right? And hence it automatically, when your government spending is going up and your tax taxes are going down, I mean, that automatically stabilizes the recessions, because that itself acts as an automatic stabilizer of a recession, right? But at the same time, that automatically creates a budget deficit as well. But what we are trying to say over here is that so it's the budget deficit that is created in a recession automatically, because the government spending is going up and taxes are going down, right? That also acts as a automatic stabilizer to stabilize recessions. And what we conclude is that, even if so the second point is that even if some budget deficit would happen automatically, because in a recession, while some budget deficits may be implemented and enacted by the government to reduce the recessions, like, let's say, as we already are aware, that how much John Maynard Keynes was in favor of expansionary fiscal policy in a recession to counter the recession, and how he went in favor of government spending, that how could government spending bring the economy out of recession. And so if we say that the government has enacted the budget deficit and it is increasing government spending to bring the economy out of recession, even then a budget deficit is acting as a counter-cyclical tool, because it is ultimately, when the government is reducing those recessions, it is smoothing out the fluctuation, it is smoothing out the recession, stabilizing the recession, smoothing out the fluctuations in economic activity, smoothing out those recessions, and stabilizing the economy during those economic downturns and recessions, right? So that's another very good point that you need to write, right? And you see, I mean, the way I'm explaining it, you have to understand it's all about how you write it. I mean, the reason why, so you need to, your expression should be very, you should sound like an economist speaking in your exam, right? And if you look at the cons of a budget deficit, that is the disadvantage of a budget deficit. So, I mean, first of all, obviously, when you are running into a budget deficit, you need to finance that. So, deficit financing, would mean that the government will have to borrow, and when the government borrows, it needs to pay interest on it. Sometimes these interest payments are huge, right? And that diverts the funds from other productive uses, because and at times the government doesn't even have the money to pay back the interest, and so it ends up borrowing more, right? Just borrowing more to finance the interest. I mean, to finance the interest payments, and at time pay off the debt. The government borrows more debt in order to service the previous debt, right? And that just leads to a potential debt trap, right? Also, I mean, when the government runs into a budget deficit, it is increasing government spending, and that could potentially be inflationary as well, right? Especially if the budget deficits are huge. So if there's excessive deficit spending, then that could be highly inflationary, eroding the purchasing power of money, right? And the fact that when you have a huge budget deficit and the government borrows, it results into a huge debt burden, which results into a rise in national debt, because when the government borrows money by issuing bonds, right, and debt instruments, the national debt of the country goes up. And by the way, I made a video on budget deficit and the national debt, and it's on my channel. You should definitely be watching it. It's going to help you understand the concept of national debt, right, and how is it related to the budget deficit. So make sure that you watch that video. So budget deficits would increase the debt burden and increase national debt, and at times, developing countries, that is why they're unable to, service that debt, and at times there are countries whose debt burden is so high that at times and that is why economists calculate debt to GDP ratio. That at times the debt itself, the national debt, is twice as much as that of the country's GDP. Right, whatever the country is earning as income, it has more debt than what it is earning as income, right? Which results into, which is a big risk, and the country could potentially run into a risk of default, right? And the fact that that the debt burden could balloon itself, I mean, and so that is why persistent budget deficits are concerning as well, because if the budget deficit is persistent, it's not just about one fiscal year. Maybe the budget deficit is persistent and keeps on growing every year. So that can lead to a growing national debt, imposing a burden on future generations. Because if the government will end up, imposing a burden on future generations through higher taxation, so that the government can use that tax money to service the debt in future. Or maybe the government could end up reducing essential government spending, essential government services on education, healthcare. That will worsen income inequality then, right? So these are all the potential disadvantages that you need to write and think of, right? And so budget deficit basically matters, right? Budget deficits are important in the context that they are an important indicator of a government's fiscal health. This is an important line that you students should write as well. They are definitely a very important indicator of a government's fiscal health, because but because the thing is that budget deficit is indicating, what is it indicating? It's indicating that the government is spending more than it is taking in, and hence the difference is financed through borrowing. And so, I mean, if the budget deficit keeps on increasing every year, so does the debt keeps on increasing every year, right? And like throughout the video, we already talked about how budget deficits could have various economic implications. And if you see the economic examples that you should be knowing as well, is about, for example, the Great Recession, the 2008 financial crisis, when recession came in, is basically known as the Great Recession. And that's a good example because in 2008 financial crisis, many governments around the world, they implemented large deficit financed stimulus packages, right? It's known as deficit financed stimulus packages, to bring the economy out of recession, right? To counteract the economic downturn, to counteract and stabilize the economy, right? So this is something that, and many governments around the world who were, victims of the 2008 financial crisis, the governments around the world, they implemented large deficit finance stimulus packages. So this is an example that you could give. Even Japan experienced prolonged periods of economic stagnation in the 1990s, which was characterized by deflation and low growth. So and despite the fact that the Japan ended up doing large deficit spending, the economy definitely struggled to recover, right? Which means that it's not necessary that, if the government does deficit financing and implements an expansionary fiscal policy, the economy will always recover out of a recession, which highlights the limitations of fiscal policy as well, especially if there are structural challenges involved, right? Demand challenges can be implemented. I mean, your fiscal policy can address the demand challenges by boosting AD if you have low aggregate demand or low spending in the economy. But if you have structural challenges, then it can't, right? So recessions, growth, if your growth levels are low, your economy is stagnating, and if it's from the supply side, then you have to implement supply side policies. You can't just rely on demand management policies like fiscal policy. Right, guys, so I think we are done here. I'll be ending the video. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, do mention it in the comments, and I'll see you all around in another video with a different topic. Until then, take care.